It's JJ to JJ. It's official. J.J. McCarthy will one day be throwing passes to Justin Jefferson for touchdowns for the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings traded up to acquire the 10th overall pick from the New York Jets and drafted out of Michigan, J.J. McCarthy. The Minnesota Vikings got the quarterback that they wanted. They got the most realistic quarterback on the board that was available to them, because I never bought the Drake May rumors. I never bought the idea that the New England Patriots were going to make a deal with the Giants or with the Minnesota Vikings, whom the Minnesota Vikings adore Drake May, but I never bought the idea that the Patriots were going to allow a guy that's as talented as Drake May, with a team with as many holes as the Patriots have. I just didn't buy this idea that the Vikings were going to even have a chance to draft Drake May. But what specifically stands out with this J.J. McCarthy pick? You know, there's brass knuckles. Well, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah had brass balls, because the biggest threat, well, one of them was the New York Giants, because they have been reportedly doing their due diligence on quarterbacks all the way leading up into the NFL draft. Also, I would say even furthermore, the Denver Broncos, the Las Vegas Raiders, teams that are extremely desperate to draft a quarterback anywhere in the top 10 of the NFL draft. The trade was available to them, and the Minnesota Vikings played their bluff perfectly, because instead of giving up picks 11 and picks 23 and a first-round pick next year to get to number 5 and acquire J.J. McCarthy, they gave up pick 11, got pick 10, basically a wash, and they gave up a couple of later-round picks and got a later-round pick back from the New York Jets to get the same guy that they wanted at number 5 overall. Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah played this thing like a genius. I did say before the draft that I did not think there was any chance that the Minnesota Vikings would be able to draft J.J. McCarthy at number 11. I said they would have to trade up for him. And technically, it was only one pick, but I was right. Another thing I was right about, now that I'm bragging about how right I am. Well, I called Drake May to the Patriots in February. I also said that it was a guarantee, a lock, that the Minnesota Vikings would wind up with J.J. McCarthy. I just believe that the traits J.J. McCarthy has in his overall quarterbacking game, I just believe that the Minnesota Vikings loved it. I believe that Kevin O'Connell, obsessed with his accuracy, he had like a 73% completion percentage in college. I believe he was obsessed with the ability to do play-action fake with Aaron Jones potentially if J.J. McCarthy plays in his first year, to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, T.J. Hawkinson, and more. So I've been on this for weeks, for months, since the offseason started for the Minnesota Vikings. J.J. McCarthy just looks like a Minnesota Vikings player. And as odd as that sounds, as ridiculous as it sounds, just speaking it, it's true. And the Minnesota Vikings went after him. Jim Harbaugh called this guy the best player in the draft. Well, of course, he's going to say that. He coached them at Michigan. There's nothing really else that he could say. Apparently, the Minnesota Vikings tried to trade up to get Justin Herbert out of the Chargers, and the Chargers quickly said no thank you to that. So the Minnesota Vikings end up with J.J. McCarthy because Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah made a huge risk and traded up one spot, not 6 spots at number 5, to select the same guy, and they didn't have to give up much to do it. The Minnesota Vikings keep many picks. They keep pick 23, which allows so much flexibility with that pick. They could trade down, acquire more assets for the later rounds that they gave up to acquire J.J. McCarthy, or they could pick a player that they love at pick number 23. So I love the way that Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah is handling this draft. However, I am not convinced that J.J. McCarthy is going to be a superstar NFL quarterback. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't see him as a guy that has the ability of a Jaden Daniels or of a Caleb Williams. I believe those guys are on a different stratosphere than J.J. McCarthy. But I do believe J.J. McCarthy is a capable starter in the league, a capable guy that can take the Minnesota Vikings to the playoffs eventually. But I do not believe he is that Super Bowl quarterback that the Minnesota Vikings, or that will take the Minnesota Vikings to new heights, to the first Super Bowl ever in Minnesota Vikings history. I just don't think he's that guy. I believe in 5 years or 4 years, when the Minnesota Vikings have to make a decision on J.J. McCarthy, whether or not they extend him, whether or not they pick up his fifth-year option, I believe that decision is going to come with lots of debate. It's going to be similar to Daniel Jones with the New York Giants when he came out of Duke University. I just believe that J.J. McCarthy, he's got the tools to be a good game manager in the NFL, but he is not a guy that's going to take a team and take them to a Super Bowl. Everything would have to go perfect for J.J. McCarthy. The system, the players, the offensive line, the defense. It would have to be a Brock Purdy, San Francisco 49ers situation for J.J. McCarthy to take the Minnesota Vikings to a Super Bowl and win it. And I just don't think that's realistic. I just don't think that's going to happen. So at the end of the day, the Vikings got their guy. They needed a quarterback, and I am pleasantly surprised that they did not have to give up much to get him. And I am actually pleased somewhat. I'm not overly ecstatic. I would have been overly ecstatic if the Minnesota Vikings drafted Drake May and gave up 5 first-round picks to get him, as ridiculous and as crazy as that sounds. However, if he brings the Minnesota Vikings to Super Bowl, who really cares how much the Minnesota Vikings had to give up to acquire Drake May? And I just don't see that in J.J. McCarthy. His system, the coaching staff in Michigan, the players around him in Michigan, he was carried to a national championship, and you don't have to look much further than the Penn State game where Michigan ran the football 30-something straight times in a row as J.J. McCarthy just handed the ball off that many times. It's like, what kind of elite team with an elite quarterback or a supposedly elite quarterback does that? I just don't get it. Do you think that if Michigan had Caleb Williams or Jaden Daniels or even Drake May for that matter, that they would have handed the ball off 30-something straight times against Penn State? No, I don't see it. It makes no sense. So there are reservations that I have about J.J. McCarthy, but what I'm pleasantly surprised about, and I talked about this all leading up to the draft, I knew the Vikings were going to draft J.J. McCarthy. I was 100% confident this was going to happen. However, what I needed from the Minnesota Vikings was to not give up too much to get him, was to not give up too many assets to get the same guy that really won't lead the Minnesota Vikings to a Super Bowl. So I'm happy that they didn't give up too many assets, but yet I'm still hesitant because they still got a guy that I don't think is capable of taking the Minnesota Vikings organization to a Super Bowl and to new heights. But I'm happy they kept pick 23. I'm happy they have assets later on because I just don't think J.J. McCarthy was worth that. And Kwesi Adofo-Mensah played the Giants, the Broncos, and the Vegas Raiders bluff perfectly. Well, that's going to do it. If you're watching on Facebook, check out the Minnesota Tim page on YouTube, a Minnesota Vikings podcast. That would be greatly appreciated. Subscribe to that channel where you can get way more takes like this. I will be reacting to what the Minnesota Vikings do at pick number 23, and I'll be reacting way more in future days, discussing J.J. McCarthy to the Minnesota Vikings as he weighs in, as the Minnesota Vikings organization weighs in, and as so many more players share their thoughts and reactions to the Minnesota Vikings drafting J.J. McCarthy. This take was presented by Hokeland Farm. Contact Hokeland Farm. Contact Jared at Hokeland Farm at 952-491-1541 for 100% grass-fed beef, contact Jared and tell him you heard about Hokeland Farm on the Minnesota Tim podcast and get 20% off your first order by doing so. Everyone, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching wherever you are watching, and I appreciate you making this podcast and this episode a part of your day.